Our next speaker is Professor Ephraim Meir. Professor Ephraim Meir is Professor Emeritus of Modern Jewish Philosophy at Bar-Ilan University, Ramat Gan. For several years, he was the Levinas Guest Professor for Jewish Dialogue Studies and Interreligious Theology at the Academy of World Religions, University of Hamburg. Recently, he has been a research fellow at the Center of Theological Inquiry in Princeton and a fellow at the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study in South Africa. He is president of the International Rosenzweig Society. Welcome.
Thank you, Tamar. Shortly after Hitler's takeover of power, Buber writes to his publisher Lambert Schneider that publishers and writers will have to learn to live in catacombs. Writers will have to write in such a way that the rulers do not immediately perceive their resistance. From 1933 until his arrival in Jerusalem in March 1938, Buber coped with the harsh reality of Hitler's politics. His engagement in Jewish adult education was already an act of resistance. His literary production of that period is a protest and a cry for an alternative society and politics. Buber's texts reflect his reaction to the folkish ideology of Germany. His literature of resistance objected an exclusivist identity politics and a political theology. It aimed at the elimination of a pathological hypernationalism and an authoritarianism that destroyed the equality of all. I argue that Buber's writings in the 30s are an act of resistance and that, in a broader sense, his consistent political resistance before, in, and after that period appears in many of his writings that belong to different scholarly disciplines. A holistic reading of these interrelated writings allows us to rediscover Buber as an eminent political thinker, resisting a politics disconnected from ethics. Although there has been some early attention to Buber's prophetic politics, research on Buber's theopolitical thinking has been a rather neglected field. Only recently, publications give due attention to Buber as a political thinker who protests a political theology. Scholars such as Sam Brody and Christoph Schmidt focus on Buber's critique of Carl Schmitt's political theology and on Buber's Theopolitics and Königtum Gottes, which challenges Schmidt's friend Fu politics. Just as Levinas's political theory was discovered in his Talmudic readings rather than his philosophy, when discovered Buber's political stance in his exegetical work. Against Schmidt as the crown jurist of the Third Reich, who divinized the earthly dictator and secularized theological concepts in the service of politics, Buber retained the nomadic ethos of pre-monarchic Israel. In his protest against the instrumentalization of religion in function of the authoritarian state, he followed the anti-monarchic position of the judges Gideon and Samuel and the prophets. Sam Brody has written an excellent book on Buber's anarchist Theopolitics, which contests a fascistic political theology that puts the divine in service of political power. He notes that Buber has been received mostly as a philosopher or a theologian. In his view, Buber's Theopolitics, I quote, is better accounted for through a combined reading of his writings on the Bible, together with his explicit political thinking in Passes in Utopia, and in his occasional writings on Zionism, unquote. Brody utters his suspicion that reading Buber's politics in terms of his dialogical philosophy explains why he is relatively absent from the political conversation today. I suggest rather that what prevented scholars to discover Buber's political thinking is that he was classified as an unrealistic, merely religious thinker. However, for Buber, religion was primarily an exemplary dialogical life. It penetrated all spheres of life, including the political one. Buber opposed the privatization of religion and its instrumentalization in the service of politics. With his humanist and social concept of religion, he became an active resistor, swimming against the tide. A close reading of the broad range of his writings reveals that the first president of this academy was a prominently political thinker. The new scholarship discovers Buber's Counterculture and Resistance in Königtum Gottes, published in 1932. Divine kingship was not theocracy or a divine kingdom, but a unified reality in which the religious and the political were interlaced. Buber's biblical writing was never purely religious, since he did not separate the holy from the profane. There was a tension, not a separation. It has been remarked that Carl Schmitt is not mentioned in Königtum Gottes, but when one reads the book in light of Buber's 1936 article, The Question of the Single One, Schmidt's fingerprints are all over the text. Indeed, Buber's essay sheds retrospective light on Königtum Gottes. The essay attacked Schmidt's anti-liberal authoritarian politics of power and was a courageous act of resistance. It offers Buber's view on the single one as a responsible human being in an anarchic community. The state was necessary and problematic. The question to the single one is the only place where Buber openly refers to Schmitt, who became famous or unfamous in the 20th and the 30th of the preceding century. With Carl Schmitt, who claimed that the essence of politics was the capacity to define the friend and the enemy, Jews quickly became a scapegoat as threatening the German cohesion. Against the dichotomistic thinking characteristic for populists, with their rhetoric of alternative facts, Buber's transformational thought reflects his profound belief in dialogue between people and in a true community that does not pursue a coercive power politics. To create a new we, he opposes a politics that distinguishes between friends and foes. In dialogical communities, individualism as an I without a you, and collectivism as a you without an I could be overcome. Against an ethnic nationalism, Buber developed an inclusive attitude that made coexistence and mutuality between the I and thou possible. Of course, his writings on Zionism remain crucial in rediscovering Buber's it remains crucial in rediscovering Buber's anarchist political thought. In a today most actual critique of nationalistic perspectives and of a politics that is based on people's fears, Buber represented a moral Zionism that cares for the Arabs in the land. His theology of the land is not a divinization of it, but in function of Israel's ethical mission. In his 1944 lectures published in On Zion, in Amle Arzo, both the land and the people are in the perspective of the realization of an ethical society. Their election was not ontological, but ethical. Politics should not be cut off from religion as ethics. The focus in recent scholarly literature on Buber's Theopolitics in Königtum Gottes, in the question of the single one and in his Zionist writings, is certainly useful to draw attention to Buber as a political thinker. But theopolitics as the combination between politics and ethics are present in many other writings of Buber. Given the unity in Buber's work, his philosophy, his translation project, his so-called religious writings, his Zionist thoughts, his exegetical work, as well as his reimagination of Hasidism, are all closely linked and offer us a coherent, combined picture of Buber as a political resistor. A few examples will suffice in order to demonstrate how Buber, in many of his writings, not only in the period between 33 and 38, resists an autonomous, autarkic politics devoid of ethics. Let me start with I and thou. In I and thou, Buber deems that politics is subservient to the spirit and linked to human relations. I quote, "The economy as the house of the will to profit and the state as the house of the will to power participate in life as long as they participate in the spirit," unquote. In this passage, Buber clearly designs a dialogical community characterized by equality and a lack of domination and exploitation. Asaf Zierman rightly defines Buber's dialogical thought as a philosophy of action. He further notes that one cannot bracket the dialogical principle to explicate Buber's Theopolitics. Buber is indeed a hedgehog in Isaiah Berlin's terminology. He knows one single thing, dialogue, or interconnectedness, which appears in his entire oeuvre. His political philosophy is dialogical in that it responds to a given situation starting from one's whole undivided being. Brody briefly suggests that a reintegrating of Buber's philosophical anthropology and his theopolitics, I quote, will certainly bear fruit for the future, unquote. By his own bracketing of Buber's philosophy of dialogue to elaborate his theopolitics, he leaves me some work to do. I argue that Buber's dialogical philosophy and his theopolitics cannot be separated, and that is exactly what I want to show. As early as in I and Thou, but also in his Bible translation, Buber is political. With his former equivalent translation in cooperation with Rosenzweig, he strived to revive the gesprochenheit of the biblical word. The biblical word had to speak again. Through their work on the Bible, Buber and Rosenzweig opposed Marcionite tendencies and decried anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. According to Buber, the political theologian Wilhelm Stapel opposed their translation out of fear that, I quote, the mere dissemination of the actual scriptures undermines the effort through theologically legitimate state violence, unquote. In his article Biblischer Humanismus, published in October 1933, Buber opposes the Greek concept of the word in the polis as above the problems of the day with a Hebrew understanding of the word, which is to be listened to and made true in the Edah, in the community. Responding to the biblical word was a therapy for the people of his time, who had forgotten interrelatedness and dialogue. Not catastrophic overturning and political revolution, but slowly and consistent turning was needed. Against Plato, who approached the truth as a preconceived idea of an unfolding history that can be remembered, Buber maintained that the prophets criticized the existing society in view of improving it. We described criticism of politics from an ethico-religious viewpoint. Buber remained critical of religion separated from ethics. This stance is central in his resistance. Religion had become separated from reality itself. Above all, it had compromised itself with Nazi politics. It had forgotten to relate to this messy world in which unity had to be realized against the Marcionite rejection of the world. In an article of 1936, Buber complains that religion has become part of the detached spirit. The Hebrew Bible had become a religious writing, something pious or scientific, not compromising anymore the whole of life. To cure the chasm between the scriptures and the human being of today, one had to start experiencing revelation. The biblical word was a voice through which one becomes a metamorphized dialogical being. Against the absolutization of politics, Buber maintained that spirit and concrete life, the holy and everyday life, belong together. In a prophetic perspective, the politics of Israel was theopolitics. For Buber, the horrible events of the 30s were the result of reviving Gnostic ideas. He felt that the unity between the spiritual and the worldly order was broken. In a clear act of resistance, he publishes in 1933 his essay, The Faith of Judaism. He analyzes how the Old Testament was rejected in his days as the result of a long process, starting with the evangelist John and Marcion and continuing with Adolf von Harnack, who stamped the preservation of the Old Testament as the consequence of religious and ecclesiastical paralysis. Safely arriving in Jerusalem in 1939, Buber blames Marcion's dualistic thinking as destructive for Israel. Von Harnack, he now openly says, continued Marcion's messianic thought that negated the world, preparing in this way the domain for Hitler's action against the Jews. In Buber's messianism, on the contrary, a person takes upon herself responsibility relating to a world that may be repaired and redeemed. Messianism was the restoration of God's kingship after it had been lost. Tikkun olam was possible and necessary. Not only in his dialogical philosophy and in his reflection on Judaism and on the Jewish Bible, but also in his writings on Hasidism, Buber reveals himself as a political thinker. Inspired by this popular movement, he desired to hallow everything, including the political sphere. In what Paul Mendes-Flohr calls a non-noetic conception of faith, he frequently uses the term Bewährung, putting to prove in action. Spirituality as a realization of unity had to be verified in daily life, including in the political realm. In his neo-Hasidism, Buber reimagined Hasidism as a theopolitical community. Finally, in his writings on and to Gandhi, Buber is again a religio-political thinker. Significantly, his Gandhi die Politik und Wir, first published in 1930, was reprinted as an annex to Die Frage an den Einzelnen in 1936. Buber much appreciates Gandhi's non-violence, but also criticizes him because Gandhi did not enough distinguish between religion as orienting goal and politics, which remain a means. Against the British colonialists, Gandhi wanted political successes and independence, Swaraj, as soon as possible. His famous Salt March in 1930 was a pilgrimage with political intent. Buber, for his part, retained a permanent tension between religion, or ethics, and politics. The political serpent, he writes, is not essentially evil. It is itself only misled. It too ultimately wants to be redeemed. Prophetic religion as orientation is an infinite goal. Buber viewed Gandhi as a prophetic figure whose experiments made the divine manifest. But his mission had a tragic character. The unconditionality of Gandhi's spirit and the conditionality of the masses clashed. Nevertheless, Buber admired Gandhi's ahimsa, his non-violence, as the non-violent promotion of life. His refusal of the Schmittian political theology of sovereignty and his shaping of a dialogical society were not far from Gandhi's experiments. Both Buber and Gandhi strived for an egalitarian, non-hierarchical, non-violent society. They both fought against imperialism and domination. 9 years later, reacting to Gandhi's infamous letter on the Jews of 26 November 1938, Buber refuses Gandhi's advice to the Jews to become satyagrahis. In reference to the Bhagavad Gita, Buber opts to fight for justice, but to fight lovingly. Further in his letter, Buber tried to convince the Mahatma, who did not favor the Jewish immigration to Palestine, that Jews and Arabs could live together in service of the land. With his thoughts on the renewal of Judaism, on utopian socialism, and on freedom and non-coercion under the divine kingship, cooperation was possible and necessary. Before and after World War II, Buber and Gandhi wanted a state that intervenes as little as possible in the lives of people. In their active, non-violent resistance, they were critical of the abuse of power by the state. I conclude. I conclude that Buber, in the period from 33 until 38, developed the resistance literature. In many of his writings, before, in and after that period, he opposed an autonomic politics unlinked to a dialogical ethics. He refused to separate politics and religion or ethics in all his writings. The prophetic religious political voice promoted alliances between people in small anarchist ethical communities. In the kingdom of God, all spheres of life, including the political one, had to be hallowed. Buber listened to a voice that had to resonate in this world, one had to live in this world with a kind of otherworldliness. In his humanistic, unromantic, and non-mystic religiosity, Buber wrote in I and Thou, I quote, "World here, God there, that is it talk. God in the world, that too is it talk. But leaving out nothing, leaving nothing behind, to comprehend all the world, in comprehending the you, giving the world its due and truth, to have nothing besides God but to grasp everything in Him, that is perfect relationship," unquote. Politics had to contribute to the birth of the Zwischenmensch. Against domination, exploitation and sovereignty, the relation to Arabs as equal to Jews in a land that was commonly owned was part and parcel of Buber's egalitarian, socialist, moral Zionism. In his resistance to a dominating, exploiting and aggressive Zionism, he was ready to accept the accusation that he was a traitor, what one calls today denigratingly a terrorist, or better, an anarchist. Buber was a political thinker, a resistor to reactionary forces, a fighter for equality and human rights, not only in his exegesis, but also in his dialogical philosophy, in his view on Christianity and on Judaism, in his translation project with Rosenzweig and his creative reinterpretation of Hasidism. Religion and life, ethics and politics were inseparable. In his utopian vision, there was no separation between the holy and the profane, between the earthly and the heavenly, but the tension remained. I deem that there is a need to revisit Buber's entire oeuvre in a holistic reading to fully grasp his position on the relation between politics and ethics and a sustainable and coherent resistance to an autarkic politics. Thank you.